The transport ship Meridian's edge shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its hull groaning under the stress of dimensional transition. Captain Marcus Chun steadied himself against the navigation console, watching the view screen flicker to life with the image of Kepler 442b. The planet hung before them like a blue-green jewel, its surface marked by vast oceans and unfamiliar continents. Final approach initiated, Captain, announced Lieutenant Rodriguez from the pilot's seat. Landing Zone Alpha is clear. Weather conditions are optimal. Marcus nodded, but his attention was drawn to the figure standing at the observation deck's far end. Ambassador Lyralii of the Etherian Collective had barely moved during the entire 3-week journey from Earth. Her tall, graceful form seemed to shimmer in the starlight filtering through the reinforced transparent steel, and the crystalline formations that served as her hair caught and refracted the light in patterns that hurt human eyes to look at directly. The Etherians were humanity's first contact with an advanced alien civilization, and Lyralii was the first of her kind to agree to extended diplomatic relations with the human colonies. The peace treaty they were traveling to finalize would determine whether humanity could expand beyond their current 17 worlds or remain confined to their small corner of the galaxy. Ambassador, Marcus called softly, approaching her position. We'll be planet-side within the hour. The Zephyrian delegation is already waiting at the conference site. Lyralii turned toward him, her movements fluid as water. Her face was hauntingly beautiful by human standards, though Marcus knew that comparing alien features to human concepts of beauty was probably inappropriate. Her eyes were pools of shifting silver that seemed to hold depths of wisdom and sadness. Captain Shun, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his chest. I must confess, I am apprehensive about these proceedings. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Throughout their journey, the Etherian ambassador had been composed to the point of seeming emotionless. This admission of uncertainty was the first crack in her diplomatic facade he had witnessed. The Zephyrians have agreed to mediate fairly, he offered. Their reputation for neutrality is well established throughout this sector. It is not their mediation I question, Lyralii replied, moving closer to the viewport. It is whether your species and mine can truly understand each other well enough to coexist peacefully. The statement hung in the air between them. Marcus had spent weeks studying Etherian culture and philosophy in preparation for this mission, but he was beginning to realize how little humans truly understood about their potential allies. What do you mean? He asked. Lyralii was quiet for a long moment, her silver eyes reflecting the planet below. When she spoke, her words carried a weight that seemed to press against Marcus's consciousness. Your people speak of desires, Captain, of wants and needs and ambitions. These concepts are central to human nature, are they not? Yet for my people, desire is considered dangerous. It leads to attachment, and attachment leads to suffering. Marcus considered this. He had read about Etherian philosophy, but hearing it explained in personal terms gave it a different meaning. So your people don't want things? Don't have goals or hopes? We seek harmony, Lyralii said. Balance. The absence of want creates peace. But I have observed humans for many cycles now, and I see that your desires drive you to achieve impossible things. You reach for stars because you want to touch them. You explore unknown worlds because you desire to know what lies beyond your sight. The ship's intercom crackled to life. Captain to the bridge. Beginning atmospheric entry in 10 minutes. Marcus acknowledged the call, but remained at Lyralii's side. Something about this conversation felt important, though he couldn't articulate why. Is that wrong? He asked. To want things? To strive for more than what we have? I do not know, Lyralii admitted. That is why these negotiations are so crucial. If our species are to share the galaxy, we must understand what drives each other. The entry into Kepler 442b's atmosphere was smooth, the ship's advanced shielding protecting them from the worst of the friction heating. Below them, the landscape unfolded in breathtaking detail. Vast forests of silver-leaf trees stretched to the horizon, broken by rivers that gleamed like mercury in the alien sun's light. The Zephyrian Conference facility was a marvel of bioengineering, grown rather than built from what appeared to be living coral. Its organic curves and flowing lines seemed to emerge naturally from the landscape around it. As the Meridian's edge settled onto the designated landing pad, Marcus could see other ships already present. The Zephyrian delegation's vessel resembled a massive seed pod, its surface covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as he watched. Two smaller craft bore the distinctive geometric markings of the Etherian collective. "Showtime," Marcus muttered, straightening his dress uniform. The delegation from Earth was small, but carefully chosen. Besides Marcus and Lyralii, it included Dr. Sarah Martinez, humanity's leading xenopsychologist, and Commander James Park, a military attaché whose job was to assess potential security implications of any agreement reached. The Zephyrian Greeting Committee was unlike anything Marcus had encountered in his 20 years of space service. The beings stood nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies resembling upright mantises covered in iridescent chitin that reflected the light in rainbow patterns. Their movements were precise and deliberate, each gesture carrying obvious ceremonial significance. "Welcome, beings of distant stars." Their leader spoke through a translation device that rendered the words an accented but clear standard. "I am Nessinger Quillith of the Third Harmony. We are honored to facilitate this gathering of minds." The ceremony of introduction took nearly 2 hours, with each delegation presenting gifts and reciting formal acknowledgments. Marcus found himself studying Lyralii throughout the process, noting how she seemed to move in perfect synchronization with her fellow Etherians, as if they shared some unspoken communication. The conference facility's interior was even more impressive than its exterior. The walls seemed to pulse with bioluminescent patterns, and the air carried a faint scent of ozone and growing things. The main negotiation chamber was circular, with seating areas arranged to ensure no delegation held a position of apparent superiority over the others. "The formal sessions will begin tomorrow at the rising of Kepler's primary star," Quillith announced. "Tonight, we invite all participants to join us for the evening of understanding, where we may speak freely without the constraints of diplomatic protocol." Marcus had been briefed about this tradition. The Zephyrians believed that successful negotiations required personal connections between the participants. The evening of understanding was designed to allow delegates to interact as individuals rather than representatives of their respective governments. The gathering took place in a garden courtyard beneath Kepler, 442b's star-filled sky. The alien constellations were beautiful but utterly foreign, reminding Marcus of how far they were from Earth. Tables laden with foods compatible with each species' biochemistry were arranged around a central fire pit, where something resembling driftwood burned with flames that shifted through the visible spectrum. Marcus found himself gravitating toward a quiet corner where he could observe the interactions between the various delegates. The Etherians moved through the crowd like dancers, their conversations consisting as much of subtle gestures and harmonized tones as actual words. The Zephyrians were more direct, their large eyes taking in everything while they asked pointed questions about human and Etherian culture. "Captain Chun." He turned to find Lyralii approaching, carrying 2 cups of what appeared to be some kind of warm beverage. "Ambassador, how are you finding the evening?" "Educational," she replied, offering him one of the cups. "I have been observing your fellow humans. They are fascinating." Marcus sipped the drink, which tasted like honey mixed with starlight, if starlight had a flavor. "Fascinating how Dr. Martinez speaks with such passion about her work. Her desire to understand other minds drives her to ask questions that others might consider intrusive. Commander Part watches everything with the eye of someone who desires to protect his people, even in a peaceful setting. Even you, Captain, desire something, though you hide it well." The observation was more personal than Marcus had expected from the usually formal ambassador. "What do you think I desire?" Lyralii studied him for a moment, her silver eyes seeming to look through him rather than at him. You desire understanding. Not just knowledge, but true comprehension. You want to know why things are as they are, and how they might be different. Marcus was surprised by her accuracy. It was true that he had always been driven by curiosity, by a need to understand not just the mechanics of how things worked, but the deeper patterns that connected them. Is that such a strange desire? He asked. Not strange, Lyralii said, but it is very human. My people would say that such desire leads to suffering, because true understanding may be impossible to achieve. They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the other delegates interact. A group of Zephyrians was demonstrating some kind of musical communication to Dr. Martinez. Their chittering calls creating complex harmonies that seemed to convey meaning beyond words. May I ask you something, Ambassador? Marcus said finally. Please. If Etherians avoid desire, what motivates you? What brought you here to negotiate with species so different from your own? Lyralii was quiet for so long that Marcus began to wonder if he had somehow offended her. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. That is a question I have been asking myself throughout our journey, she said. By the teachings of my people, I should feel no attachment to the outcome of these negotiations. Success or failure should be equally acceptable. But I find myself invested in ensuring that our species find a way to coexist. That sounds like desire to me, Marcus observed gently. Yes, Lyralii agreed. It does. And that troubles me greatly. The fire in the central pit shifted to a deep blue, casting strange shadows across the courtyard. Marcus noticed that the conversations around them had grown quieter, more intimate, as if the alien flames created a space for deeper confidences. Why does it trouble you? He asked. Lyralii turned to face him fully, her expression more open than he had ever seen it. Because if I can feel desire, then perhaps I am not as evolved as my people believe themselves to be. Or perhaps, she paused, seeming to wrestle with the words. Perhaps the teachings of my people are incomplete. The admission hung between them like a bridge across a vast chasm. Marcus realized that this was likely the first time an Etherian had ever voiced such doubts to a member of another species. What if that's not a weakness, he suggested. What if desire is what allows different species to find common ground? Without wanting something together, how can we build anything meaningful? Lyralii considered this, her head tilted in a gesture that Marcus was beginning to recognize as deep thought. Around them, the evening of understanding continued, but their corner of the courtyard felt isolated from the rest of the gathering. You speak as if desire could be a tool for connection rather than a source of suffering, she said finally. Isn't that what brought us here? Marcus asked. Your people's desire for a peaceful expansion of their territory, humanity's desire to explore and settle new worlds, the Zephyrians' desire to maintain stability in this sector. All of our wants led us to this moment. The alien fire shifted again, this time to a warm golden hue that reminded Marcus of Earth's sun. Lyralii's crystalline hair caught and scattered the light, creating patterns that seemed almost like written language. In my studies of human culture, she said, I learned about something called hope. It seems related to desire, but different somehow. Can you explain this concept? Marcus thought about how to articulate something so fundamental to human experience. Hope is desire tempered by uncertainty, he said eventually. It's wanting something while acknowledging that you might not get it, but choosing to believe in the possibility anyway. And this gives your people strength? Sometimes. Sometimes it gives us the courage to try things that seem impossible. Lyralii nodded slowly. We have been negotiating for months through subspace communications, but tonight feels like the first time I am truly speaking with a human rather than talking at one. The observation struck Marcus as profoundly important. All the formal diplomatic exchanges, the carefully worded proposals and counterproposals had been mere surface interactions. This conversation, sparked by questions about desire and hope, was touching something deeper. "What happens tomorrow?" he asked, "when we return to being representatives instead of individuals?" "I do not know," Lyralii admitted. "But I think tonight has changed something. For me, at least." The evening wind carried scents from the alien forest surrounding the conference facility, strange but not unpleasant aromas that reminded Marcus of cinnamon and ozone. In the distance, something that might have been an indigenous bird made calls that sounded almost like music. "Ambassador," Marcus said, "may I ask you something that might seem impertinent?" "After tonight's conversation, I think formality between us would be the truly impertinent choice," Lyralii replied with what might have been humor. "Please ask, what do you want from these negotiations? Not what your government wants, not what your people expect, but what you personally hope will happen." The question seemed to catch Lyralii off guard. She stared at him for several heartbeats, her silver eyes reflecting the shifting flames of the ceremonial fire. "I want," she began, then stopped. "This is difficult. My entire education has taught me not to form personal attachments to outcomes. But if you could want anything," Marcus pressed gently, "if you allowed yourself to desire something from tomorrow's talks, what would it be?" Lyralii looked up at the alien stars wheeling overhead. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note that Marcus had never heard from an Etherian before, something raw and honest and vulnerable. "I want our species to surprise each other," she said finally. "I want humans and Etherians to discover that we can become something together that neither of us could achieve alone. I want us to prove that difference does not have to mean conflict." The admission seemed to shock her as much as it surprised Marcus. She had essentially confessed to wanting the impossible, to hoping for a future that had never existed between any two species in known galactic history. "That's a beautiful desire," Marcus said softly. "It is also probably futile," Lyralii replied, but there was no sadness in her voice, only a kind of wondering acceptance. "Maybe," Marcus agreed, "but isn't the possibility worth exploring?" The fire in the central pit began to dim, signaling that the evening of understanding was drawing to a close. Around them, delegates were beginning to retire to their quarters, but Marcus found himself reluctant to end this conversation. "Captain," Lyralii said, "tomorrow, when the formal negotiations begin, remember what we have spoken of tonight. Remember that beneath all the diplomatic language and political maneuvering, we are beings capable of wanting the same things." "I will," Marcus promised. "And Ambassador, thank you for trusting me with your hopes. I don't think many humans have been privileged to see that side of Etherian nature." "Perhaps that has been the problem," Lyralii mused. "Perhaps true understanding requires the sharing of vulnerabilities as much as strengths." As they walked back toward the quarters assigned to the human delegation, Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation in ways that went beyond its immediate diplomatic implications. Something fundamental had shifted between them, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended species boundaries. Tomorrow would bring the complex business of negotiating territory rights, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts. But tonight had established something more valuable than any formal treaty, the foundation for genuine understanding between two very different forms of consciousness. The realization that an Etherian could experience desire, could hope for outcomes, and form personal attachments to ideals changed everything Marcus thought he knew about their potential allies. And if Lyralii's admission was any indication, the revelation was equally profound from her perspective. As he settled into his quarters for the night, Marcus found himself looking forward to tomorrow's negotiations with a sense of anticipation he had not expected. Whatever happened in the formal talks, tonight had proven that meaningful connection between humans and Etherians was possible. That knowledge alone made the long journey to Kepler 442 be worthwhile. Outside his window, the alien night was filled with sounds of a living world, a symphony of unknown creatures going about their nocturnal business. Somewhere in the facility, delegates from 3 different species were preparing for tomorrow's crucial discussions. But Marcus carried with him the memory of silver eyes reflecting firelight and a voice confessing to forbidden hopes, and he knew that everything had already changed in ways that no formal agreement could capture. The morning sun of Kepler 442b cast long shadows across the conference facility as delegates gathered for the first formal session. Marcus arrived early, finding the main chamber already filled with the quiet activity of preparation. Zephyrian technicians made final adjustments to translation equipment, while junior diplomats from all 3 delegations reviewed their briefing materials one last time. Lyrelii entered the chamber precisely at the appointed time, accompanied by 2 other Etherians whose names Marcus struggled to pronounce correctly. She moved with the same fluid grace he had observed the previous evening, but something in her demeanor had changed. The vulnerability she had shown during their private conversation was carefully contained behind layers of diplomatic composure. Yet Marcus caught brief glimpses of something different in her silver eyes when their gazes met across the chamber. Nestsinger Quillith called the session to order with a complex series of harmonic tones that the translation matrix rendered as formal greetings. The opening ceremonies took nearly an hour, with each delegation presenting their credentials and stating their intentions for the negotiations. "The matter before us," Quillith announced, "concerns the establishment of territorial boundaries and resource-sharing agreements in what humans designate as Sector 7 Alpha. The Etherian Collective seeks expansion rights to 17 systems currently claimed by human colonial administration. Humanity requests continued development privileges in these same systems. Our task is to find an arrangement that serves the needs of all parties while maintaining galactic stability." Marcus listened to the formal language with half his attention while studying the dynamics between the various delegates. The Etherian team moved and spoke with unsettling coordination, as if they shared some form of collective consciousness. Dr. Martinez was taking detailed notes on their behavior patterns, her xenopsychologist training clearly engaged by the opportunity to observe alien group dynamics in action. Commander Park sat rigid in his chair, his military bearing evident even in the diplomatic setting. Marcus knew that Park's primary concern was ensuring that any agreement reached would not compromise human defensive capabilities or create strategic vulnerabilities. "The human position," Dr. Martinez began when called upon to present humanity's opening statement, "is that our settlements in the disputed systems represent significant investment in infrastructure and terraforming efforts. 7 of these worlds now support combined populations of over 2 million human civilians who have established permanent communities." She gestured to a holographic display that materialized above the central table, showing detailed population distributions and economic data from the human colonies. "However," she continued, "we recognize the Etherian Collective's need for expansion and are prepared to discuss creative solutions that might serve both our people's interests." Marcus noted the emphasis on creative solutions. It was diplomatic language for acknowledging that traditional territorial divisions might not be adequate for this situation. The lead Etherian delegate, an individual introduced as Harmony Keeper Valanthe, responded with a statement that seemed to flow like music despite the mechanical translation. "The collective appreciates humanity's investment in these systems," Valanthe said. "However, our expansion needs are driven by population pressures that will become critical within 2 standard centuries. We do not seek to displace human settlements, but we must secure resources necessary for our people's survival." The morning session proceeded with each side presenting their detailed positions, mapping out the specific systems and resources under discussion. Marcus found himself impressed by the thoroughness of the preparations. Every world, every asteroid belt, every strategic location had been cataloged and analyzed. During a mid-morning recess, he found himself walking in the facility's bioengineered gardens alongside Lyrelii. The alien plants around them seemed to respond to their presence, shifting colors and orientations in ways that suggested a level of awareness that Earth vegetation lacked. How do you think it's going so far? Marcus asked, keeping his voice low. Both sides are stating their positions clearly, Lyralii replied diplomatically. But I sense that we are still speaking past each other rather than to each other. Marcus nodded. The formal presentations were necessary, but they felt like elaborate dances around the real issues. What do you think the real obstacles are? Lyralii was quiet for several steps, her crystalline hair catching and refracting the alien sunlight. Fear, she said finally. Your people fear that sharing these systems will limit your expansion. My people fear that without access to these resources, our civilization will stagnate. And both fears are probably justified, Marcus observed. Yes, which is why traditional approaches to this problem are unlikely to succeed. They paused beside a fountain where water fell upward in defiance of gravity before cascading back down in complex helical patterns. The sound it made was like wind chimes mixed with distant thunder. Last night, Marcus said carefully, you spoke about wanting our species to surprise each other. What would that look like in practical terms? Lyralii turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. I've been considering that question all night. What if the solution is not to divide these systems between us, but to share them in ways that have never been attempted before? Meaning, joint colonies, shared infrastructure, mixed settlements where humans and Etherians live and work together. Lyralii's voice carried a note of excitement that was unusual for her species. Your people excel at rapid adaptation and innovation. Mine bring long-term planning and resource management capabilities. Together, we might achieve colonization efforts that neither species could accomplish alone. Marcus felt a spark of recognition. The idea was audacious, unprecedented, and potentially brilliant. Has anything like that ever been tried between different species? Not in recorded galactic history, Lyralii admitted, which is precisely why most would consider it impossible. But you don't. No, she said, meeting his eyes. After our conversation last night, I find myself believing that impossible things might be worth attempting. The afternoon session resumed with technical presentations about resource extraction capabilities and population growth projections. Marcus found himself only half listening to the detailed data while his mind turned over Lyralii's suggestion. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made from multiple perspectives. Human colonies were notorious for rapid establishment, but often struggled with long-term sustainability planning. Etherian settlements were models of environmental harmony, but developed slowly due to their careful consideration of every possible impact. Combined colonies could potentially overcome the limitations of both approaches. When Nessinger Quillith called for closing statements from each delegation, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. If I may, he said, rising from his seat, I'd like to propose that we consider an alternative to traditional territorial division. Dr. Martinez shot him a sharp look, clearly wondering what he was planning. Commander Park's expression became distinctly uncomfortable. Marcus was stepping outside his designated role as transport captain and de facto security advisor. The proposal I want to put forward, Marcus continued, is joint colonization of the disputed systems. Not divided territories, but truly shared worlds where human and Etherian settlers work together from the very beginning. The chamber fell silent. Marcus could see shock on the faces of the human delegation, careful attention from the Zephyrians, and something that might have been hope from Lyralii. Harmony Keeper Valanthe was the first to speak. This proposal has no precedent in galactic law or custom. How would such arrangements be governed? How would disputes be resolved? How would resources be allocated? I don't know, Marcus admitted. But I think those are exactly the kinds of problems that our species working together might be uniquely qualified to solve. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. Captain Chun, while I appreciate innovative thinking, the practical challenges of such an arrangement would be enormous. Our species have completely different social structures, environmental needs, and decision-making processes. All true, Marcus agreed, but we also have complementary strengths: human adaptability and Etherian long-term planning. human innovation and Etherian resource management, human individual initiative and Etherian collective harmony. He turned to address the entire chamber. What if instead of fighting over these systems, we use them as laboratories for interspecies cooperation? What if we prove that different forms of consciousness can not only coexist, but create something greater than the sum of their parts? Quilitha's insectoid features were unreadable, but Marcus sensed interest from the Zephyrian delegation. As mediators, they were probably intrigued by any proposal that moved beyond zero-sum territorial division. This suggestion requires significant consideration, Quilith announced. We will recess for the remainder of today to allow all delegations to discuss this proposal internally. Tomorrow's session will address the practical implications of joint colonization efforts. As the chamber emptied, Marcus found himself surrounded by his fellow humans. Dr. Martinez looked intrigued but concerned, while Commander Park appeared distinctly unhappy. Marcus, Martinez said, that was either brilliant or completely insane. I'm not sure which. The military implications alone, Park began, but Marcus held up a hand. I know. Believe me, I understand the risks. But I also think we might be looking at an opportunity that won't come again. He glanced across the chamber to where Lyralii was deep in conversation with her fellow Etherians. Their discussion looked intense, with rapid gestures and harmonic vocalizations that suggested significant disagreement. What made you think of joint colonies? Martinez asked. Marcus considered how much to reveal about his private conversation with Lyralii. Sometimes the best solutions come from asking different questions. Instead of, how do we divide what we want? Maybe we should be asking, how do we create what we need? That evening, Marcus found himself alone in his quarters, reviewing technical specifications for human colonization equipment and wondering if he had just sabotaged months of careful diplomatic preparation. The proposal for joint colonies had felt right in the moment, but the practical challenges were genuinely staggering. A soft chime indicated someone requesting entry. Marcus opened the door to find Lyralii standing in the corridor, her usual formal composure replaced by something approaching agitation. May I come in? She asked. I need to speak with you privately. Marcus stepped aside to let her enter. His quarters were Spartan but functional, with a small sitting area near the observation window that looked out over the alien landscape. Your proposal today, Lyralii began without preamble. It has caused significant discussion within my delegation. Good discussion or bad discussion? Both. Lyralii moved to the window, her reflection ghostly in the transparent material. Harmony Keeper Valanthe believes the idea is too radical to consider seriously. The risks of cultural contamination and philosophical corruption are, in her view, unacceptable. Marcus felt a sinking sensation. And you? I argued that cultural exchange might be enrichment rather than contamination. That philosophical interaction might lead to growth rather than corruption. Lyralii turned from the window. It was not an easy conversation. What happens now? Valanthe has agreed to consider the proposal, but only if certain conditions can be met. Safeguards to preserve Etherian cultural integrity. Protocols to prevent human influence from disrupting our traditional ways. Marcus nodded slowly. Those don't sound unreasonable. They're not unreasonable, Lyralii agreed. But they may not be sufficient to address the real challenge. Which is? Lyralii was quiet for a long moment, seemingly gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice carried the same vulnerable quality Marcus had heard the previous evening. Captain, may I ask you something personal? Of course. Yesterday evening, you asked me what I truly desired from these negotiations. I answered honestly, perhaps more honestly than I have ever spoken to anyone. But I never asked you the same question. Marcus felt a flutter of apprehension. The question seemed simple enough, but something about Lyralii's tone suggested deeper implications. What do I want from these negotiations? No, Lyralii said, moving closer. What do you truly desire? Not as Captain Shun, representative of humanity, but as Marcus, the individual I spoke with beside the ceremonial fire. The distinction was crucial, Marcus realized. His official desires were clear, successful negotiations that secured human expansion rights while avoiding conflict with the Etherian collective. But his personal desires? I want to understand, he said finally. I want to know if beings as different as humans and Etherians can find genuine common ground. I want to prove that consciousness itself is more important than the particular form it takes. Lyralii nodded slowly, and I want to discover whether my people's pursuit of perfect harmony has led us to a dead end, whether growth and change might require the kind of chaotic creativity that humans represent. They stood facing each other across the small space, and Marcus felt the weight of implications that extended far beyond the formal negotiations. What are you suggesting? He asked. That perhaps our personal desires and our diplomatic objectives are more aligned than either of our governments realize, Lyralii replied. You propose joint colonies because you want to see what our species might accomplish together. I support that proposal because I want to see what I might become through contact with human perspectives. The admission was startling in its honesty. Marcus realized that Lyralii was essentially confessing to wanting something that her entire culture considered dangerous. That sounds like what humans would call taking a leap of faith, he observed. Yes, Lyralii agreed. It is precisely that, and it terrifies me. Marcus understood. They were discussing something that went beyond diplomatic agreements into uncharted territory of personal transformation and cultural evolution. What happens if we fail? He asked. If joint colonies turn out to be a disaster? If cultural exchange leads to conflict instead of understanding? Then we will have learned something important about the limits of cooperation between different forms of consciousness, Lyralii replied. But what if we succeed? What if we discover that difference is a source of strength rather than division? The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Outside the window, Kepler, 442b's alien night, was beginning to fall, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that no human had ever seen before their arrival in this system. Lyralii, Marcus said, using her name without formal title for the first time. If we're going to make this work, if joint colonies are going to be more than a diplomatic fantasy, we need to be honest about what we're really proposing, which is, we're not just talking about sharing territory or resources. We're talking about our species learning to think together, to plan together, to dream together. Marcus paused, considering his words carefully. We're talking about becoming something new. Lyralii's silver eyes reflected the alien sunset, creating patterns that seemed almost like written language. Yes, she said simply. That is exactly what I desire. The admission carried weight that seemed to fill the small quarters. They were no longer discussing abstract diplomatic possibilities, but acknowledging personal commitments to an unknown future. Tomorrow, Marcus said, when we present the detailed framework for joint colonization, we're going to face opposition from both our governments. Are you prepared for that? Are you? Lyralii countered. Marcus thought about the months of preparation that had gone into these negotiations, the careful balance of interests and competing priorities that any successful agreement would need to address. What they were contemplating would throw all of that careful planning into chaos. Yes, he said, surprising himself with his certainty. I think I am. Lyralii smiled, an expression that transformed her alien features in ways that Marcus found unexpectedly moving. Then, perhaps tomorrow we will begin to discover what impossible things become possible when different forms of consciousness choose to trust each other. As she prepared to leave, Lyralii paused at the door. Marcus, there is something else you should know. Harmony Keeper Valanthe has agreed to consider your proposal, but she will test you tomorrow. She will ask questions designed to expose any hidden human agenda, any secret desire to dominate or control Etherian culture. How should I respond? With the same honesty you showed me tonight, Lyralii replied. Tell her what you truly desire, even if it seems impossible. Especially if it seems impossible. After she left, Marcus stood at his window watching the alien stars emerge in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring challenges that no amount of diplomatic training had prepared him for. But tonight had established something that no formal protocol could create: genuine trust between two beings who had chosen to see past the differences that separated their species to recognize the hopes they shared. The negotiations had become something more than territorial disputes and resource allocation. They had become a test of whether consciousness itself could evolve through contact with other forms of awareness. And Marcus found himself eager to discover what the universe might look like when viewed through eyes that had never been entirely human or entirely Etherian, but something new altogether. The morning air on Kepler 442b carried an electric tension as delegates assembled for what everyone understood would be the crucial session. Marcus had spent the night reviewing technical specifications for habitat construction and resource distribution systems, but his mind kept returning to Lyraliai's warning about Harmony Keeper Valanthi's intentions to test him. The chamber buzzed with quiet conversations as translation equipment was calibrated and final preparations completed. Marcus noticed that the Etherian delegation had been joined by 2 additional members who had arrived during the night, their presence suggesting that the collective was taking the joint colony proposal seriously enough to send additional experts. Dr. Martinez leaned over to whisper in his ear, "I've been running preliminary calculations on resource requirements for joint settlements. The logistics are complex, but not impossible. Integration of human and Etherian technologies could actually create significant efficiencies." Commander Park looked less optimistic. "I've been thinking about security implications. Mixed settlements would be extremely difficult to defend using conventional military doctrine. We need entirely new approaches to colonial defense." Nessinger Quillith called the session to order with ceremonial harmonies that seemed more complex than those of previous days. Marcus sensed anticipation from all 3 delegations, as if everyone present understood that they were about to venture into uncharted territory. "Today we address the proposal for joint colonization of disputed systems," Quillith announced. "This concept has no precedent in galactic law, requiring us to consider entirely new frameworks for interspecies cooperation." Harmony Keeper Valanthi rose to speak, her movements carrying the fluid grace common to all Etherians, but with an additional quality of focused intensity. "The collective has considered Captain Chen's proposal through the night cycles," she began, her translated words carrying harmonics that suggested careful deliberation. "We find merit in certain aspects, but significant concerns remain." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Here it comes," he thought. "Our primary concern," Valanthi continued, "relates to the fundamental compatibility of human and Etherian consciousness. Your species operates through individual decision-making processes that often prioritize short-term benefits. Our consciousness seeks harmony and long-term stability that spans multiple generations." She gestured to a holographic display that materialized above the central table, showing complex patterns of energy flow that Marcus assumed represented some form of Etherian planning methodology. Joint colonies would require unprecedented integration of these different approaches. We must ask ourselves, is Captain Shun proposing genuine cooperation, or does humanity seek to gradually assimilate Etherian capabilities while maintaining human dominance? The chamber fell silent. Marcus realized that this was the test Lyraliai had warned him about. Harmony Keeper Valanthi wasn't just questioning the practical feasibility of joint colonies. She was challenging the fundamental honesty of human intentions. Dr. Martinez started to respond, but Marcus stood up, knowing that this moment required personal rather than professional answers. "Harmony Keeper Valanthi," he began, "you're asking me to reveal human motivations that I can't speak for all of my species. But I can tell you what I personally desire from this proposal." He moved away from his delegation's seating area, positioning himself where he could address all 3 groups equally. "What I want," Marcus continued, is to discover whether consciousness can evolve through contact with different forms of awareness. Not human consciousness dominating Etherian thought, or vice versa, but something entirely new emerging from genuine interaction between our species. Valanthi's silver eyes remained fixed on him. That sounds like philosophical romanticism rather than practical planning. What specific benefits does humanity expect from such arrangements? Marcus felt the weight of every person in the chamber watching him. This was the moment where diplomatic language would either serve or betray the deeper truth he was trying to communicate. I expect human colonists to be changed by working with Etherian partners, he said. I expect us to develop planning perspectives that extend beyond our traditional time horizons. I expect us to learn forms of decision-making that balance individual initiative with collective harmony. He paused, gathering his thoughts for what he knew would be the crucial part of his response. But more than that, I expect joint colonies to create new forms of consciousness that are neither entirely human nor entirely Etherian. I want our children to grow up thinking in ways that neither of our species has ever thought before. The admission seemed to surprise even him. Marcus realized that he had just articulated something he had barely acknowledged to himself: the desire for humanity to be transformed through contact with alien consciousness. That is a dangerous desire, Valanthi observed. It suggests willingness to sacrifice human nature for uncertain benefits. No, Marcus replied. It suggests confidence that human nature is strong enough to grow without losing what makes us essentially human. Lyralii rose from her position with the Etherian delegation. If I may, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that Marcus was beginning to recognize as emotional intensity. I would like to address Harmony Keeper Valanthi's concern from a different perspective. Valanthi's expression showed surprise at the interruption, but she gestured for Lyralii to continue. For 3 days, I have been observing human consciousness in action through close contact with Captain Chun and his team, Lyralii said. What I have discovered challenges many of our assumptions about the dangers of desire-driven thinking. She moved to the center of the chamber, her crystalline hair catching and refracting the bioluminescent wall patterns in ways that created shifting mandalas of light. Captain Shin asked me yesterday what I truly desired from these negotiations. My answer surprised me. I want our species to surprise each other. I want us to discover capabilities that neither of us suspected we possessed. Valanthi's silver eyes narrowed slightly. That sounds remarkably like the human concept of hope, which our teachings identify as a form of attachment that leads to suffering. Yes, Lyralii agreed, her voice carrying a note of defiant certainty. It is exactly like hope, and I have discovered that hope might be a tool for growth rather than a source of suffering. The chamber erupted in quiet but intense discussion. Marcus could see shock on the faces of the other Etherian delegates, while the Zephyrians leaned forward with obvious interest. This was clearly not the direction they had expected the conversation to take. Ambassador Lyralii, Valanthi said carefully, you are suggesting that contact with human consciousness has led you to question fundamental principles of Etherian philosophy? I am suggesting, Lyralii replied, that perhaps our philosophy is incomplete, that perhaps the absence of desire has led us to a form of stagnation that masquerades as wisdom. Marcus felt a surge of admiration for Lyralii's courage. She was essentially challenging her entire culture's worldview in front of both her colleagues and alien witnesses. Consider, Lyralii continued, that human desire to explore unknown systems brought us to this moment. Etherian pursuit of harmony alone would never have led to contact between our species. Perhaps we need both approaches to achieve our full potential. One of the newly arrived Etherian delegates, introduced earlier as Seeker Thranduil, rose to speak. These are profound philosophical questions that extend far beyond the scope of territorial negotiations. Are we prepared to use colonial experiments as testing grounds for fundamental cultural evolution? Dr. Martinez finally found her opening to contribute to the discussion. If I may offer a scientific perspective, she said, we already have evidence that close contact between different forms of consciousness produces beneficial effects. She gestured to her own holographic display, showing brain scan data and psychological assessment results. Over the past 3 days, I've been monitoring the neurological and psychological responses of all human participants in these negotiations. Sustained interaction with Etherian consciousness patterns has produced measurable changes in human cognitive processing, increased pattern recognition, enhanced long-term planning capabilities, improved emotional regulation. Marcus was startled by this information. Martinez had been conducting medical monitoring without his awareness, though he supposed it made sense from a xenopsychological research standpoint. More intriguingly, Martinez continued, preliminary scans of Etherian participants suggest similar adaptive changes. Ambassador Lyraliai's brain patterns show increased activity in regions associated with individual initiative and creative problem-solving. Valanthe turned sharply toward Lyraliai. You submitted to human medical scanning? With proper consent and monitoring protocols, Martinez interjected quickly. All participants volunteered for non-invasive neurological observation as part of the standard first contact research procedures. Lyraliai nodded. I wanted to understand what was happening to me. Why contact with human consciousness was affecting my thinking in ways that traditional Etherian meditation practices never achieved. And what did you discover? Thranduil asked, his voice carrying notes of genuine curiosity. That consciousness might be more flexible than either of our species has assumed, Lyraliai replied. That exposure to different thought patterns doesn't necessarily corrupt or diminish awareness, but can expand it in unexpected directions. Marcus found himself thinking about his own experience over the past few days. Had his thinking patterns changed through contact with Etherian consciousness? Looking back, he realized that his approach to problem-solving had indeed shifted. He was considering longer time horizons, thinking more systematically about unintended consequences, approaching decisions with a patience that was unusual for him. Nessinger Quillith had remained silent throughout this exchange, but now the Zephyrian mediator's complex features showed what Marcus interpreted as intense interest. This discussion has moved beyond practical colonization logistics into questions of consciousness evolution, Quillith observed. As mediators, we must ask whether such experiments fall within acceptable parameters for territorial agreements. Commander Park spoke up for the first time during the session. From a military perspective, I have to point out that colonies whose populations are undergoing fundamental consciousness changes would present unprecedented security challenges. How do you defend settlements when you don't know what the inhabitants will become? It was a sobering question that brought the discussion back to practical realities. Marcus appreciated Park's willingness to voice legitimate concerns rather than simply opposing the entire concept. That's exactly the kind of problem that joint colonies would be designed to solve, Marcus replied. Instead of human military doctrine trying to protect hybrid populations, we develop integrated defense strategies that combine human and Etherian capabilities from the beginning. But that assumes successful integration, Valanthe pointed out. What happens if consciousness evolution produces instability instead of enhanced capability? What if joint colonies become sources of conflict rather than cooperation? Marcus looked around the chamber at delegates representing 3 different species, all of whom were grappling with questions that had never been asked before in galactic history. The weight of potential consequences was enormous, but so was the possibility for unprecedented advancement. Harmony Keeper Valanthe, he said, earlier you asked me what humanity really wants from joint colonies. I tried to answer honestly, but let me be even more specific. He moved to the central display area, where holographic representations of the disputed systems hung in 3-dimensional glory, each planet and moon tagged with resource data and strategic assessments. We want to prove that different forms of consciousness can create something greater than the sum of their parts. Not because we think human consciousness is superior and should dominate, or because we want to absorb Ethereum capabilities for our own purposes, but because we think the universe becomes more interesting when different minds learn to think together. Marcus gestured to the star maps surrounding them. Look at what we're fighting over. 17 star systems, a handful of habitable worlds, some mineral resources, and strategic shipping routes. But what we're really discussing is whether the galaxy will be divided into separate zones of consciousness, or whether we can create something unprecedented, truly integrated civilization. Thranduil leaned forward. And what if integration fails? What if consciousness evolution produces chaos instead of growth? Then we learn from the failure and try different approaches, Marcus replied. But the alternative is accepting that different forms of consciousness are permanently incompatible. That the galaxy will always be divided into separate spheres of influence that view each other as threats rather than opportunities. Lyralii moved to stand beside Marcus in the center of the chamber. 3 days ago, I would have said that Captain Chen's proposal was impossible because human and Ethereum consciousness operate on fundamentally incompatible principles. But I have discovered that my own consciousness is more flexible than I believed. She turned to address Valanthe directly. The question is not whether consciousness evolution is dangerous. Of course it is dangerous. The question is whether the potential benefits outweigh the risks. And what benefits do you envision? Valanthe asked. Hybrid settlements that combine human adaptability with Ethereum sustainability. Defense strategies that integrate individual initiative with collective planning. Cultural exchange that produces new forms of art, science, and philosophy that neither species could create alone. Lyralii paused, her silver eyes reflecting the chamber's bioluminescent patterns. Most importantly, the possibility that consciousness itself might evolve in directions that we cannot currently imagine. That our children might develop forms of awareness that make the conflicts between our current approaches irrelevant. The chamber fell silent as delegates absorbed the implications of what was being proposed. Marcus realized that they had moved far beyond territorial negotiations into a discussion about the fundamental direction of galactic civilization. Quilitha's harmonic voice finally broke the silence. We are approaching the limits of what can be decided in formal diplomatic sessions. These questions require careful consideration by all three governments represented here. Valanthe nodded slowly. The collective will need to consult with our consciousness keepers and long-term planners. What is being proposed goes beyond colonial policy into fundamental questions about the nature of Ethereum identity. Dr. Martinez gathered her holographic displays. From a scientific standpoint, I recommend establishing small-scale pilot programs before committing to full colonial integration. Limited contact experiments that allow us to study consciousness evolution under controlled conditions. Commander Park remained skeptical, but thoughtful. Military command will need detailed security protocols for any integrated settlements. We'll need entirely new approaches to threat assessment and defensive planning. Marcus felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration as the formal session drew to a close. They had ventured into territory that no previous diplomatic negotiations had explored, asking questions about consciousness and identity that challenged basic assumptions of all three species present. As delegates began to file out of the chamber, Lyralii approached him with an expression that mixed hope and apprehension. "Do you think we have accomplished something important today?" she asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. They had certainly moved beyond simple territorial disputes into discussions that might reshape galactic civilization. But whether they had accomplished something positive remained to be seen. "I think," he said finally, "that we've started a conversation that needed to happen. Whether it leads where we hope is still unclear." Lyralii nodded. "Tomorrow we present specific proposals for pilot programs. Are you prepared for the practical challenges of turning philosophical discussions into workable policies?" Marcus looked around the empty chamber where three species had just grappled with questions that had never been asked before. Outside the facility's organic walls, An alien sun was setting over landscapes that no human had seen before their arrival on this world. No, he admitted, but I think that's exactly the point. If we were prepared for what comes next, it wouldn't be worth attempting. As they walked toward the exit together, Marcus found himself wondering whether the conversation they had started would ultimately transform galactic civilization or destroy the careful balance that had maintained peace between different forms of consciousness. But he was certain of one thing. The universe would never look quite the same to any of them again. 6 months after the Kepler 442b negotiations, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the research station New Harmony, watching the first joint human-Etherian settlement take shape on the surface of Kepler 7. The world below was a study in organized chaos, with human prefabricated modules rising alongside flowing Etherian biostructures that seemed to grow directly from the planetary substrate. Status report, Captain, came Dr. Martinez's voice over the comm system. The integration protocols are showing remarkable success rates. Marcus smiled, remembering the skepticism that had greeted their return to Earth with the signed accords for experimental joint colonies. The political battles had been fierce, with numerous factions arguing that the risks of consciousness contamination outweighed any potential benefits. Only the intervention of President Morrison herself had allowed the pilot program to proceed. The Etherian Collective had faced similar resistance, with several conservative Harmony Keepers arguing that contact with human desire patterns would corrupt their philosophical foundations. It had taken Lyraliai's passionate advocacy and the support of progressive factions within their government to secure approval for the experiments. "I'm heading down to the surface," Marcus announced into his comm unit. "I want to see the integration process firsthand." The shuttle trip to the settlement took 20 minutes, providing Marcus with an aerial view of what was being called the most ambitious social experiment in galactic history. From above, the community looked like an abstract artwork, with geometric human structures flowing seamlessly into the organic curves of Etherian architecture. Landing Pad 7 was jointly managed by human and Etherian personnel, with standardized protocols that had been developed through months of trial and error. Marcus was met by Sarah Kim, the settlement's human administrator, and resonance singer Athen, her Etherian counterpart. "Captain Chun," Kim said, extending her hand in greeting. "Welcome to New Harmony. Population as of today, 237 humans, 185 Etherians, and 43 hybrid children." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Hybrid children?" Athen's harmonious voice provided clarification. "Not biological hybrids, of course, but human children raised with significant Etherian cultural input, and young Etherians educated through human pedagogical methods. The results have been unexpected." They walked through the settlement's central plaza, which served as a perfect example of architectural integration. Human engineering had provided the structural framework, while Etherian biocultivation had created living walls that regulated atmosphere and temperature while providing aesthetic beauty that neither species could have achieved alone. "The hybrid education program has produced the most interesting results," Kim explained as they passed a group of children playing what appeared to be a complex three-dimensional game involving floating geometric shapes. Human children exposed to Etherian meditation techniques show enhanced pattern recognition and emotional regulation. Etherian young ones learning human creative methodologies display unprecedented individual innovation. Marcus paused to watch the children's game more closely. What he saw challenged his understanding of both human and Etherian capabilities. The mixed group was working together to solve problems that required both individual initiative and collective harmonization, switching seamlessly between competitive and collaborative modes as the situation demanded. "How are the adults adapting?" he asked. Athen gestured toward a work site where mixed teams were constructing something that looked like a fusion of human technology and Etherian biological cultivation. "Initial resistance has given way to curiosity and then to enthusiasm. Humans working with Etherian partners report enhanced job satisfaction and reduced stress levels." Etherians collaborating with human colleagues described their work as more dynamic and creatively fulfilling than traditional collective projects. They continued their tour, visiting workshops where human engineers and Etherian biosculptors were developing technologies that neither species had conceived independently. The fusion of human mechanical precision with Etherian organic adaptation was producing innovations in everything from habitat construction to resource processing. The most significant development, Kim said as they entered the settlement's communication center, has been the emergence of what the research team is calling hybrid consciousness protocols. Marcus examined the communication equipment, which seemed to blend human electronic systems with Etherian bioneural networks in ways that created entirely new forms of information processing. Dr. Martinez wants to brief you on the neurological findings, Athens said. The data from the consciousness evolution experiments has exceeded all projections. The research facility was located at the settlement's northern edge, where human laboratory modules had been integrated with Etherian meditation chambers to create spaces optimized for studying consciousness interaction. Marcus found Martinez in the central data analysis room, surrounded by holographic displays showing complex neural activity patterns. "Marcus," she called out, looking more excited than he had seen her since their return from Kepler 442b. "You have to see this. The consciousness evolution we theorized about is actually happening, but not in ways we predicted." She gestured to a display showing comparative brain scans of settlement participants taken over the 6-month period since the colony's establishment. "Look at these patterns," Martinez said, highlighting specific neural regions. Humans working in integrated teams show enhanced connectivity between logical and intuitive processing centers. Etherians in mixed environments display increased activity in areas associated with individual creativity and rapid adaptation. Marcus studied the data, trying to understand its implications. So both species are developing enhanced capabilities? More than that, Martinez replied, switching to a different data set. "We're seeing the emergence of new neural pathways that don't exist in pure human or pure Etherian populations. Consciousness patterns that represent genuinely novel forms of awareness." The implications were staggering. They weren't just proving that different species could cooperate. They were demonstrating that consciousness itself could evolve through sustained contact between different forms of awareness. "What about the hybrid children?" Marcus asked. "The ones being raised with dual cultural input?" Martinez's expression grew even more animated. "The most remarkable results of all. Children exposed to both human and Etherian consciousness development techniques from early age are showing cognitive capabilities that exceed both baseline populations in different areas." She brought up brain scans from the hybrid education program, and Marcus could see dramatic differences even with his limited understanding of neurology. Enhanced pattern recognition, superior long-term planning abilities, improved emotional regulation, increased creative problem-solving capacity, Martinez rattled off. And most importantly, they seem to naturally think in ways that integrate individual initiative with collective harmony. They don't see these approaches as conflicting philosophies, but as complementary tools. Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction, mixed with awe. The proposal he had made on Kepler 442b, driven more by intuition than scientific analysis, was producing results that exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. "Any negative effects?" he asked, knowing that such dramatic changes couldn't be entirely without risks. "Some adjustment difficulties for adults, but nothing that hasn't been manageable with proper support protocols," Martinez replied. "The children show no negative effects at all. If anything, they seem more psychologically stable than control groups." A gentle harmonic tone announced someone requesting entry to the research facility. Marcus turned to see Lyralii approaching through the transparent entrance corridor, her crystalline hair catching the alien sunlight in the familiar patterns that had become comforting over the months of their collaboration. "Ambassador," Marcus said, though her title had become more ceremonial as their working relationship had evolved into something closer to partnership. "Marcus," she replied, using the informal address that had become natural between them. "I have news from the collective." Her expression suggested important developments, and Marcus felt a familiar flutter of anticipation. The success of New Harmony had attracted attention throughout the galaxy, with numerous species requesting observer status for future joint colony experiments. "The Consciousness Keepers have completed their analysis of our reports," Lyralii said. "Their conclusion is that consciousness evolution through interspecies contact represents the most significant philosophical development in Etherian history." Marcus exchanged glances with Martinez. Such a statement from Etherian philosophical authorities carried enormous weight throughout their civilization. More practically, Lyralii continued, "The collective has authorized expansion of the Joint Colony Program to include 12 additional systems. They want to establish multiple experimental communities with different species combinations." "Which species?" Martinez asked immediately. "The Zephyrian Collective has expressed strong interest based on their observations of our negotiations. The Crystalline Hegemony has requested preliminary discussions. Even normally isolationist void singers have indicated curiosity about consciousness evolution possibilities." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What had begun as a desperate attempt to resolve territorial disputes was evolving into something that might reshape galactic civilization. "What does Earth Command think about expansion?" he asked. Lyralii's expression grew slightly more complex. "That brings me to the second part of my news. Earth has agreed to expanded joint colonies, but they want you to oversee the entire program. You've been promoted to Admiral and appointed Director of Interspecies Consciousness Development." Marcus stared at her, processing the implications. He had expected some form of recognition for the program's success, but this represented a fundamental change in human approach to alien contact. "And the collective?" he asked. "Has appointed me as Consciousness Evolution Coordinator for all Etherian participation in joint development projects," Lyralii replied. "We will be working together for the foreseeable future." Martinez looked between them with obvious amusement. So the two people who started this experiment by having an honest conversation about what they truly desired are now being put in charge of expanding it across the galaxy. "Apparently," Marcus replied, still trying to absorb the magnitude of what was being proposed. They walked outside the research facility to an overlook that provided a panoramic view of New Harmony. The settlement had grown beyond its original planned boundaries, with expansion modules and biostructures creating a community that pulsed with activity and innovation. "Do you remember," Lyralii said softly, "when you asked me what I truly desired from the negotiations on Kepler 442b? You wanted our species to surprise each other," Marcus recalled, "to discover that we could become something together that neither of us could achieve alone. And when I asked you the same question," Marcus smiled, remembering that crucial moment when their conversation had moved beyond diplomatic formalities into genuine personal connection. "I said I wanted to understand, to prove that consciousness itself is more important than the particular form it takes." Lyralii nodded. 6 months ago, those seemed like impossible dreams. Now we're watching them become reality. Below them, the mixed community of New Harmony continued its daily activities. Human children and Etherian young ones played together in ways that created new forms of social interaction. Adult work teams solved problems through approaches that combined individual creativity with collective wisdom. Families that transcended species boundaries were creating cultural innovations that neither humans nor Etherians had imagined independently. "What do you think will happen next?" Marcus asked. "I think," Lyralii replied, "that we are about to discover how much consciousness can evolve when it is given permission to grow beyond the boundaries we thought were permanent." The alien sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in colors that still seemed impossible after 6 months of observation. In the distance, a group of hybrid children were teaching their Etherian and human teachers a game that required forms of cooperation that neither species had developed in isolation. "Marcus," Lyralii said. May I ask you the same question again? What do you truly desire now? Marcus considered the question carefully, looking out over a community that represented the fulfillment of hopes he had barely been able to articulate 6 months earlier. Now I desire to see how far consciousness can evolve, he said finally. I want to discover what the galaxy looks like when different forms of awareness learn to think together as naturally as they once thought separately. Lyralii's silver eyes reflected the setting sun, creating patterns that seemed to write themselves across the alien sky. That is a desire that could reshape the universe, or destroy our understanding of what consciousness means entirely, Marcus observed. Yes, Lyralii agreed. But isn't the possibility worth a risk? Marcus thought about the conversation that had started everything. Two beings from different species sharing honest confessions about desires that had seemed impossible. That moment of vulnerability and trust had grown into something that was beginning to transform galactic civilization. Always, he replied. As the first stars appeared in Kepler-7's darkening sky, Marcus and Lyralii stood together watching a community that proved consciousness could evolve in directions that neither of their species had imagined. The sacred bond forged by an honest answer to a simple question had become a foundation for experiments that were rewriting the fundamental assumptions about intelligence, cooperation, and the nature of awareness itself. In the settlement below, human and Etherian families gathered for evening meals that blended the social traditions of both species. Children who thought in patterns that transcended the philosophical boundaries of their parents' cultures prepared for sleep in habitats that combined the best innovations of two different approaches to creating homes among the stars. The future they were building together was one that no one had foretold, because it was only possible when different forms of consciousness chose to trust each other enough to discover what they might become when they stopped protecting their separateness and started exploring their potential for synthesis. And in the distance, communication arrays were already sending reports back to dozens of other species throughout the galaxy, species that were beginning to wonder if consciousness evolution might offer solutions to conflicts and limitations they had assumed were permanent features of civilized existence. The conversation that had begun with a simple question about desire had become the first chapter in a story that might eventually encompass every form of awareness in the known universe. And Marcus found himself looking forward to discovering how that story would unfold, one honest conversation at a time.